And next on the list, we have Mark Hodges. If you're here today, Mark, please come forward. Thank you for being here. If you would just restate your name for the committee, who you represent, and if you could remember to keep your comments within 5 to 10 minutes.
All right. Thank you, committee members, for allowing me to be here. My name is Mark Hodges. I represent myself and my family. I live here in Boise. And if you can find the first slide there. I have a son this last year who was at Compass Charter in 8th grade. That's just a next slide, please. And because of the COVID pandemic, I was able to see some of the curricula that he was assigned, looking over the shoulder at his laptop. So saw some things I didn't expect to see. There's some unpleasant things up there as well about my background. I'm including them because it gives you some context to better understand my reaction to the school assignments. I was born and raised in Hawaii. Hawaii is a multi-ethnic society. We have a lot of different colors of people there. It was something I enjoy. However, as a Caucasian, or on the bottom there, I point out that I was referred to frequently growing up as an effing howley. I won't say the whole word for you. I experienced years of vicious, pernicious, and protracted racism towards me because I'm white. And as a child, I distinctly remember going to stores and not being served because I'm white. The reason I mention this is that racism is something that every color of person is capable of, and all colors of people can experience. It's not limited to white people being racist, and it's not limited to non-white people experiencing racism. I grew up experiencing it. And it's interesting, kind of in the Black Lives Matter mode of thinking, or the CRT mode of thinking, in Hawaii, every dark-skinned person is on one team and the white people are on another, and we're considered inferior to everybody because of our skin color. And that's how I grew up. Next slide, please. But my observations that I've developed over the years include that every person, regardless of race, can be a racist. And every race of persons, every group or race has exhibited some kind of racism or experienced racism in the past or prejudice. And people also tend to gather together with similar people, whether it's income or race or gender or sports, for mutual benefit and protection. And the other thing that I've noticed is that groups of people tend to exhibit prejudice towards people that are different. This is just a common human behavior. So we recognize this. Next slide, please. Now, I grew up with the belief that prejudice means judging without all the information. And I have teenage children now who decry everything as racist. And so we've had some family discussions where I say, hey, look, just because you have an opinion about people doesn't make you a racist. And sometimes those opinions are well justified. If we look at the experience of certain Asian nations and how they feel towards other Asians after World War II and the genocides that occurred, those are genuine feelings of resentment and anger. It's not prejudice. And prejudice means we make decisions without all the information. We rarely have all the information that we would like to have. So I was a police officer for a number of years, and I can tell you I had to make snap decisions with limited information. And sometimes that information involved race. And I will also say, growing up as white in Hawaii, I had to make snap decisions based on race. If I'm walking down the beach at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and I see a group of non-whites drinking beer at the pavilion, I know what's coming next. So I turn around and walk the other way. Is that prejudice? Technically, yes. But is it necessary? Yes, that's how I survived. The same thing applies to a woman walking in a dark alley, a person of any color confronted by a group of people of a different color. They have to make those decisions. So the reason I mention that is that in the curriculum at Compass Charter, they're trying to teach the children that all prejudice is bad. Some prejudice is not bad, and it's well-founded. What we're trying to avoid is the kind of bigotry and racism towards people. That's what we're trying to avoid, the condemnation of others based solely on their race or their gender or their sexual preference. We're trying to avoid that because we all have to live together. Next slide, please. This is a bit about an assignment that my son had, and I just want you to look at it in totality. So a number of different things that they were asked to observe, and this was in the English language arts class, 8th grade class. And they watched a film called Butterfly Circus, and in this particular film, most of the characters were white, and there was a savior character who was a Hispanic, and the children were asked to write about the reaction. Hey, no problem so far. Let's look at the next slide. Then the students were asked to look at a number of photographs and write down their emotional reactions to the photographs. By the way, the name or the rubric for this whole lesson was Combating Prejudice. So they knew going into this what this was about. The photographs, and there's copies in your handouts, included people that appeared to be Middle Eastern or Muslim, people that have dark complexions, like I grew up with, people that appeared to be immigrants or poor, gang members, convicts, obese persons, disabled persons, and homeless persons. all persons deserving of compassion, sympathy, and being treated with humanity, correct? Who's missing from the list? People like me, an average white guy. Am I not deserving of compassion, or do I ever experience prejudice? So the children were asked to respond to these pictures and write down if they felt prejudice towards these groups. Next slide, please. They were required to declare to the teacher whether or not they feel prejudice towards one or more of the persons in the photos, and they would write about it. The question they also had to address was, how would common prejudices held against these people in the photos be changed? The teacher is declaring this group of people as experiencing prejudice. And they had to post their reaction for everybody to see. And again, the people not included in there are average Caucasians and Asians. Next page, please. They were also assigned to read several poems by Langston Hughes. He's a great author. He's passed away since, but they, as far as I know, were not given the background about who this author was. These poems were decrying the experience of African Americans at the beginning of the last century. Legitimate topics. What they didn't point out was this author was a known communist supporter who traveled to the Soviet Union to help make a film, a propaganda film, about racial strife in the U.S. to undermine U.S. racial harmony. And by the way, Marxism is a parallel theory to critical race theory. Next slide, please. They were also to read an article from the American Psychological Association, and this was called A New Way to Combat Prejudice. And this article was summarizing some research that was done on ways to retrain the behavior of Caucasians towards African Americans. Sounds interesting, but they weren't presented any research about retraining the way African Americans perceive and experience Caucasians. What we have in total is a pattern of looking at the world one way. And I agree that racism should be combated. Let's do it by looking at every aspect. It's a complex topic, and everybody's involved one way or another. Next slide, please. They also had to read a short story called The Cookie Thief, and this is a woman, a middle-class woman, who has to confront her own unacknowledged prejudices in this story. This is one of the themes of critical race theory training, is that white people must confront their unacknowledged prejudice that they might have. Next, please. And then they were to read an excerpt on a book called Tattoos on the Heart, and it's a book by Jesuit priest Gregory Boyle. Does a lot of great work, but it fits the pattern. Mr. Boyle is an advocate for same-sex marriage and ordination of women priests in the Catholic Church. And deconstructing church doctrine is a key strategy of critical race theory and Marxism, has been for a long time. Next slide, please. Then they were to address this question in depth: is all prejudice rooted in fear? And then respond to the question, how can we avoid prejudice? Prejudice is never defined in the assignment, but they're led in how they're supposed to answer the questions, and they know what they're expected to say. Next question, please. And what's wrong with the material is that it teaches a simplistic view of a multiracial society and how the interactions between racial groups actually occur. And it reinforces the teaching of critical race theory that only Caucasians are the ones who exhibit racism and only non-Caucasians are the ones who experience racism, and that's flat out untrue. Next, please. It also reinforces a stereotype that African Americans are only victims of prejudice and ignores social changes since the 1930s, as well as modern trends in violent crime. It also exposes students to material written by a communist supporting propagandist and doesn't give them the context of who this writer is. Next, please. And very disturbingly, it requires the students to either confess or deny their own prejudice and write their feelings for the class to see. This is a standard technique used to bully or shame using group pressure. There was photographs in there of gang members. I was a police officer. Now, we don't generally teach our children to ignore signs of danger, whether it's traffic or weather or the way people behave and act. We teach them to be cautious. And in this particular case, they're lumping gang members in amongst these lists of people that experience prejudice. I understand they're deserving of compassion, but we don't train our children to ignore signs of danger. If somebody dresses or tattoos themselves in a way to indicate they're part of a gang, that is a physical threat to your child. This shouldn't be taught in our public schools, regardless of the race of the gang member. Next slide, please. Yep, I sure will, yep. And the upshot of the whole thing is that it puts the onus on the Caucasian students to examine themselves for prejudice, and it doesn't include everybody in that situation. And it also assumes that prejudice is based only on xenophobia. But people have good reasons to fear other races because of history, of their own personal history and the history of their people. It's the way it is. We can't allow this to continue in our schools. If we want to have a multi-ethnic and multi-religious society, we have to emphasize what binds us together as Americans, not emphasize what drives us apart. There's already too much division. We need to be focusing together. And this critical race theory is a false gospel, is what it really is what the other speaker pointed out, is that it's teaching certain children to hate themselves and others to be victims. But the gospel of Jesus Christ is that every person, no matter what their background or their color, has the opportunity to be redeemed by the blood of Jesus Christ. And that can bind us and pull us together. That's what should be in schools, not this pernicious doctrine. Thank you.
Mark, thank you so much for your willingness to come forward to the committee. Are you willing to take questions from the
Yes,
committee
Madam
members?
Chair.
Committee, are there any questions for Mark? Pete, go ahead.
I just appreciate your vulnerability, the honesty about what's being said in your heart. I just appreciate that because we are all lives matter, and we need to focus on that on a regular basis. Thank you, and God bless you.
Yes, sir, I appreciate that. Growing up in Hawaii, many people of many different colors and religions, we all live and work together. I have many different people in my family that are different religions and races, and we need to emphasize who we are together and not be driving each other apart.
Okay, any other questions? Go ahead, Ryan.
Mark, thank you for speaking today, and thank you for your courage in coming here. Were you given an opportunity to address any of this with your son's teacher?
Yes, and I would like you to show one more slide, if I may. Keep going there. I'll go to the cartoon there real quickly. I didn't mention this, but after the English language arts class, I did talk to the administrator, and the administrator said there was a fair amount of latitude given to the teachers. I spoke to the teacher. The teacher showed sympathy towards what I was describing about my history with racism, and she acknowledged that. She did not offer to change the curriculum. In the physical sciences class, and this is what finally pushed me over the edge, and I decided to contact people that could help, was this cartoon was in my son's physical science class. And if you can see there, this is it's probably too small in the back, but it's a Caucasian gentleman. He's got a necktie and a Christian cross on it, and he's explaining in a foolish way the Christian view of creation and God's sustaining of the universe, and it's mocked in this cartoon. And at the bottom right-hand panel, there's a newscaster with faux news, F-A-U-X, in the background, says, and American science students continue to lag behind the rest of the world with another dozen walking over cliffs this week. It denigrates Christian belief. I have a background in biology. I have an honors degree in biological sciences from University of Montana. I was a research biologist for years. And I'm a Christian. I asked to speak with this teacher to discuss this. I contacted the administrator, said, hey, can we get together? I want to meet with a science teacher and administrator, and I want to talk with you about, was this intentional? Why is this in the curriculum? Number two, what strategies do you have to encourage diverse viewpoints in the classroom? And number three, are you aware of the role of Christians in the development of science? That's what I asked for, and she responded saying, I spoke to the teacher. This was an accident. He apologizes. We're done. I said, no, I still want to get together and talk with you about this is very serious discrimination against my son and my family. And she refused to have a meeting with me and with the teacher to discuss this. So that's where this currently stands at Compass Charter.
Any other questions? Isaac.
Madam Chair, did the teachers or administrator, first, did you ask for or did they offer standards to justify these assignments, that they were attaching standards to justify these standards, either Common Core or state content standards?
No, sir. The English language assignment, I understood that to be within the latitude of the teacher. I was not shown a standard that either met or failed to meet. And in terms of the mocking of Christian cartoons, I don't imagine any standard would approve of that.
All right, any other questions, committee?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark,
Thank you.
for being